Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this ExChange event, which is part of the When Home is Where the Harm Is conference series, which is being run by ExChange. So ExChange is an all Wales social care research engagement network, which is run through Cascade and funded in part by Health and Care Research Wales. And we run a number of conference series per year. And this is part of the current one on domestic abuse. Our speaker this afternoon is Bridget Penhale, who I'm sure will introduce herself in a moment, who's from the University of East Anglia. So I'll hand straight over to Bridget.
Thank you very much, Martin. So as Martin said, my name's Bridget Penhale, and I'm linked to the University of East Anglia over the other side of the country from you in Norwich. Have an emeritus status at the university, so I was employed full-time there until about 18 months or so ago, and then took early retirement, but I'm still working in the field of violence, abuse and neglect and adult social care. That's probably more than enough that you need to know about me, and I'll get started with my presentation. So the topic that I've been asked to consider today with you is intergenerational aspects of abuse, neglect and exploitation. What I'd like to do is to go through some sort of background stuff initially, just to orient people, and then come on to thinking a bit about some more recent work that I've been involved in, which has a particular bearing on intergenerational aspects, or I've extracted the intergenerational aspects from that work. So what we know about this field of elder abuse is that it's not a new phenomenon. It's something that's existed probably for hundreds of years. And in fact, some of you will be aware of the Shakespeare play King Lear, which is about dysfunctional family relationships between a father and his adult daughters, and looked at through a particular lens. You could say that it relates to the theme of abuse. It's also, this is a global phenomenon. We haven't found a country anywhere in the world where there isn't some form of elder abuse, but it's relatively recently that it's been recognised, although it's quite fair to say there's been increasing concern about the topic in recent decades. So in the UK, we started looking at the area of elder abuse back in the, I guess, early 90s properly. So it's, compared to other forms of violence and abuse and exploitation, it's a comparative newcomer. And I think some of the reasons for that are what I refer to as contextual matters. So we've got an aging population in many countries across the world. So issues of demography are quite key here. And I guess linked into that is what I've referred to in the next point, which is about the sort of medical and technological advances. At the beginning of the last century, it was quite commonplace for many children to die young, and life expectancy was much lower. But what we saw through the course of that century was a range of measures in terms of public health, improved sanitation, improved nutrition, and we've also seen the sort of medical advances, which mean that people who develop health conditions or disabilities are living much longer than previously. In addition to that, I guess in the last couple of decades in particular, we've had quite a focus on advocacy and rights, so citizenship rights, human rights, and advocacy in relation to enabling individuals to speak up about their experiences. And I think a constellation of these things means that actually we've got to a point where there's much more discussion than previously about situations of violence and abuse. When I was thinking about preparing this particular presentation, I was reminded of some very early work which was published by the World Health Organization and the International Network for the Prevention of Elder Abuse, which was published back in 2000 so it's actually 20 years old now. But this was a very early study of 8 countries across different regions of the world. 2 were from Europe, not the UK. And this was looking at perceptions of older people about elder abuse, and also professionals who worked with them. But from the focus groups that took place in the different regions of the world, the sorts of themes that were coming out about what older people considered to be elder abuse to consist of were the following points that you see. So neglect, isolation and abandonment, social exclusion of individuals, violation of rights, human, legal and medical rights, not having access to medical resources in some countries, and rationing, quite severe rationing of health resources, deprivation of choices, of decision-making, finances and respect. And ageism was identified as being quite key and quite central to people's experiences as they were growing older. And some key factors that were identified were both gender and socioeconomic status, with more women being identified as at risk of experiencing violence and abuse and neglect. So what is abuse? We've got a range of definitional issues. There's no one standalone, universally agreed on definition of abuse. And although I've said that it's in the public gaze now more than it used to be, and it's talked about more than it used to be, it's still to quite an extent a hidden topic. And it's quite a taboo, particularly if we think about things like sexual abuse of older people. It's not necessarily something that individuals are going to want to pay much attention to. And of course, this is similar to the situation that we had in relation to child sexual abuse many decades ago now, that initially when issues in relation to possible sexual abuse of children were being raised, actually there was a sort of pushback initially from individuals saying surely that couldn't happen to children. But I guess there's some discussion too to be had about whether this is a private issue or something that ought to be a public concern. If we think about that age-old saying in our country, an Englishman's home is his castle. And of course, what that actually refers to is that what happens within the confines and the context of the family home should be off limits and shouldn't be open to sort of public scrutiny or interference. There's been some discussion too about whether or not we're looking at adult protection or adult safeguarding or distinct forms of abuse, be that elder abuse or abuse of adults with learning disabilities. And at the moment, the policy responses are very much in relation to adult safeguarding, as we would call it here in England. But I know that, for example, in Scotland, it's referred to as adult protection. And that the overall emphasis seems to be about looking at situations in relation to risk, vulnerability of individuals situationally to exposure to abuse, and needs for protection. But we clearly need to differentiate here. We have different types of abuse. There are different settings and locations in which these sorts of situations might occur. There are different participants who may be involved in situations and different relationships between the actors. If we think about abuse that's happening in institutional settings or care settings, what we may find is that there are a number of different witnesses to situations. So it may be not just something which is happening between a smallish number of individuals, but it may be that there are other people who actually see what's going on and may have particular perspectives about what's happened. And there are different responses and interventions to deal with these types of situations. But we're not very clear yet from the research evidence about which particular types of interventions work best and for which types of abuse. That's something that's still open to some discussion. Very quickly, types of abuse. I've said there are differing types. In sort of the classical literature around abuse dating back in the US and North America to the sort of 70s and 80s, and for us to the 90s and beyond, we have physical abuse, sexual abuse, psychological or emotional abuse, financial or material abuse or exploitation. It's a bit of a mouthful, but what it's actually referring to is that, you know, sometimes when we talk about finance, people think money, and actually it's a much wider problem. So we may be talking about people being deprived of property or their affairs, people being induced to change wills or to make gifts to individuals. We'd talk about neglect and acts of omission, and in the policy guidance which exists in England, there has been a focus on discriminatory abuse and organisational abuse. Organisational abuse is really relating to what occurs within institutional settings. But in our Care Act in England, which was passed in 2014 and implemented from 2015, there's also attention drawn to these specific types of abuse. So domestic violence, be that psychological, emotional, physical or sexual, and in addition, honour-based violence, which might affect particularly, for example, younger adults who are forced into marriage. Attention is also drawn in the statutory guidance for the Care Act to situations of modern slavery, human trafficking, domestic servitude, and every so often in the media we come across situations being reported or where prosecuted where individuals who may have some cognitive impairment or learning disability have been forced into situations of labour or have been trafficked. And one of the changes that came about with the Care Act was the inclusion of self-neglect as a specific form of abuse, whereas previously it had been considered that it wasn't part of the overall framework, although in the US context, self-neglect actually constitutes quite a high proportion of the cases which come to their Adult Protective Services organisation. If we look quickly at elder abuse and domestic violence, there are some things that we need to take into account. In relation to older people, I've already mentioned ageism, the fact that it's a hidden problem. We've also got situations of families and caregiving which come to the fore. And some of the abuse patterns that we see here are a little different in relation to the particularly my mention of high levels of neglect or also of finance. It's important that we're clear about what we're naming, however, and what we're talking about. I've said there's been, you know, relative silence about the topic until fairly recently, and it's fairly underdeveloped. And in comparison to other forms of violence and abuse, it's quite an under-researched field. The primacy of the individual and the personal has been given quite a lot of attention. What's happening at that individual level, the micro level, rather than what might be happening at meso or macro levels, the societal level in which abuse or neglect might occur. And I think it's important too for us to take into account professional identification. So when these issues were first starting to be recognised in the UK, it was professionals who first drew attention to this topic. Largely social work and social care professionals, followed by health professionals, whereas in relation to child abuse back in the 60s, it was more health professionals and paediatricians who first drew attention to what was being called baby bashing or baby battering. But with the sort of broader violence against women field, it was political grassroots action. It was the women's movement of the 70s that first drew attention to the issue rather than that professional identification. And I think this has had a bearing on what has developed in relation to policies and responses. So some key points here. the social construction of abuse and violence is very important, and it seems that power relations, just as in violence against younger women, domestic abuse, are really key here. And there are some related gender issues too, in the sense that more older women than older men are affected by abuse and neglect in later life. Institutional settings are an important context, although that's not our focus for today. But it's important to remember, I guess, that this is not just about frailty and dependence. Ageism, I think, is very central here, and is what I think of as being a sort of master category sitting in the background. And because of those high levels of ageism, where the worth of older people is demeaned and older people's value to society is not acknowledged, then in some ways abuse is a consequence. What happens to older people is not something that the individuals should be that concerned about. And I won't say that it's inconsequential for the individuals who are affected, because clearly that's not the case. But I think that in some respects, because of those very high levels of ageism, what we need to think about is that in some ways abuse may be almost permitted to occur. And citizenship and rights-based perspectives are very important. If we think about possible perpetrators, partners and spouses are often implicated in situations of a domestic nature, but other family members and relatives, the intergenerational perspectives are also involved here, and I'll say a little bit more about that later. Friends and neighbours may be involved. There may be paid staff or professionals even in the domestic setting, and then you get a sort of range of other individuals, such as people who exploit adults that they perceive to be easy to abuse or to target, or who may be seen as being particularly vulnerable. And you may get volunteers or strangers, although in the definition which was adopted by the organisation, the charity Action on Elder Abuse, which is now known as Hourglass, the definition that they developed, stranger abuse is not included. But that's not a definition which is in sort of government circulation. The definition which was identified for the No Secrets document back in 2000 was abuse is a violation of an individual's human or civil rights by any other person or persons. Very broad definition. And interestingly enough, the Care Act statutory guidance doesn't contain a specific definition of abuse and violence, but it does then sort of delineate the different types, as I've talked about. There are some barriers to identification. Much of the mistreatment that occurs in private, even in institutional settings. I think we've got a range of societal views and attitudes which sometimes get in the way. We're a bit ambivalent about violence. I might say more about that if a question arises, but what is a normal amount of violence? What's acceptable as violence? We tend to sort of shift in terms of our views on that. Our views and attitudes about families and relationships and about caregiving in later life are also sometimes a bit ambivalent, and they do vary. There's been a reluctance to report situations of abuse and neglect, less so now perhaps, but certainly for quite a long time, professionals might have been hesitant to raise issues of abuse and neglect, maybe because of fear of making things worse, but also because of not wanting to raise expectations of individuals. But older people themselves may be quite reluctant to talk about situations that are happening for a range of different reasons, and we might choose to come back to that. Government principles on adult safeguarding, these will be familiar to quite a lot of people, but protection, prevention, partnership and accountability, empowerment, obviously very key here. In relation to principles on violence against women, we see some similar sorts of themes: prevention, provision of services, partnership, and justice outcomes, including protection. Older women are rarely considered as a specific or separate group in relation to abuse, and work relating to younger women or violence against women often doesn't include older women or women with disabilities, although thankfully that's beginning to change now. But work in relation to safeguarding or elder abuse often doesn't reflect the experiences of needs of older women, and it's looking much more at welfare situations rather than what might be happening in terms of relational aspects. So the needs of older women are not always fully considered or explored. Been undertaking some work with colleagues at Durham recently on perpetrators of domestic abuse of older people. This has been a very rapid Home Office funded study, and we had 3 specific phases: a rapid evidence review, an analysis of Section 42 inquiry case files and case documents, and interviews with 66 professionals, those who were involved in safeguarding or working in domestic abuse with either victims or perpetrators or both. From our evidence review, we found very few studies which had a specific focus on perpetrators. And if information was included in broader studies, then largely the sort of information that was gathered was in relation to the gender of a perpetrator and sometimes the relationships involved. Likewise, quite limited information was contained in the Section 42 case files. So it wasn't, although there was quite a lot of information gathering about the situation of the person who was identified as a victim, there was very little about the situation of the perpetrator. So there was limited knowledge to be gained about the backgrounds of those people who were alleged to have abused or who perpetrate abuse. Limited knowledge in relation to their health status, substance misuse or use, any criminal history, including situations where there was been previous violence, employment or education status. And from the evidence, most of the perpetrators that appear to be male and largely sons of older parents, but there were quite a high proportion of spouses or partners who were involved in what might be considered to be intimate partner violence. There were reports and studies where females were involved as perpetrators. These were mostly daughters, but there were some instances where there were spouse partners involved as perpetrators, so female spouses or partners, but to a lower proportion, a lower extent than with the male perpetrators. And as I've said, really quite limited information contained in that Section 42 inquiries. From the practitioner interviews, domestic abuse was identified by those individuals as being either intimate partner violence related or adult family violence categories. And our interviewees were suggested that there were similar proportions of those specific instances. In the literature, information about mental health needs and or substance misuse of the perpetrator is cited quite often. And this was also found in both the case file analysis and from the interviews, particularly relating to adult sons and daughters, and information about either alcohol or drug misuse, or indeed specific mental health needs. Criminal histories were reported as occurring fairly often during interviews, particularly so for adult sons or daughters, less so for perpetrators where there was intimate partner violence related issues. And in about a quarter of the case files we analysed, we found that type of history of either of criminal history in the past. But one of the things that we identified was a need for really much more specific evidence and more routine data collection about these sorts of situations relating to perpetrators. We looked at the information on risk factors during the evidence review, and commonly found risk factors that occurred across the evidence, but also from the interviews and the case analysis, were poor physical and or mental health. Excuse me. And it could be that individuals had both physical and mental health problems. And that was found in both the interviews and case analyses. Dependency of either the victim on the perpetrator or vice versa, the perpetrator on the victim, perhaps dependency for emotional support or finance or accommodation needs. Generational attitudes, norms and beliefs, and high levels of ageism, negative perceptions and attitudes. It comes all the way back to that very early slide that I showed you from the research that was undertaken by the WHO, that ageism was, and those sort of stereotypes and attitudes towards older people in later life was held to play a key part. But little information seemed to be gathered on risk factors by the professionals, and such abuse didn't appear to be always picked up by services. Within domestic abuse services, sort of more centrally, older people and their needs appeared to be lacking in terms of the fact that they weren't always visible. And views about perpetrators of domestic abuse seem to relate largely to younger males and situations relating to younger people. From the case file analysis that we undertook, there was little use of formal risk assessments. And from the interviews that we held with professionals in safeguarding, but also in domestic abuse work, there was little direct work with perpetrators of abuse against older people, and specifically older perpetrators. Formal risk assessments, the interviewees were actually saying to us that they didn't think that those risk assessment tools which were used in relation to younger people experiencing abuse, such as CARDA or DASH, were necessarily appropriate for work with older people and risk assessment of older people. The other piece of research that I want to refer to just in a few minutes was a piece of work I undertook for a chapter, and was actually about media reporting. And what I wanted to look at within that was media representation of situations of elder abuse in family settings. So for a period of about 15 months, I looked at both the BBC website and regional news outlets, and also had alerts set, and picked up examples concerning elder abuse in adult safeguarding, and then sort of analysed these in terms of patterns of reporting. And I also looked at a Twitter feed which is called Counting Dead Women, which reports on deaths of women by men. And I was looking specifically at deaths of older women, and looked at the annual report on femicide that they produced. So in terms of elder abuse by family members in the community, obviously I broke down into those specific settings, so institutional settings, community settings, non-relatives. But of those elder abuse reports, over that 15-month period, there were media reports of familial situations for 14 different cases, so a total of 55. And as you can see, the highest proportion was in institutions. There were 4 reports of intimate partner violence related incidents. All the victims were female, all were killed by their partner or spouse. There was 1 report of a homicide, homicide or murder, suicide of a husband who killed his wife and then committed suicide, and a further report of an attempted suicide, which failed. And both the man and his wife had health conditions. But in relation to other forms of family relationships, there were 4 reports of abuse by sons. In 1 report, a son killed both parents, and in 3 reports of abuse by sons, it referred to financial abuse, there was or neglect or murder, and this was specifically abuse against or death of mother by son. There was 1 report of financial abuse by the partner of a daughter. They were not apparently formally married, but it was a very long-term relationship. And in fact, this man had lasting power of attorney for the older woman. So this was financial abuse of an older woman. And there were 3 reports of abuse of mothers by daughters. Sorry, I skipped that. So 1 was in relation to neglect and 2 related to financial abuse. The majority of the reports were taken from police reports or court cases or criminal proceedings, although there was 1 fairly long BBC report about financial abuse and scams. Financial abuse was portrayed as being greed related, and if it occurred by a relative, it was often seen as inheritance related, even if the person wasn't dead. So it was somebody cashing in on what they assumed would be coming to them later before the person had actually died. Limited coverage given to neglect, little reporting of sexual abuse or assault within the media within that time period. The majority of murders by partners or spouses were not framed as intimate partner violence, and the murder-suicide context was framed as relating to ill health. In the Counting Dead Women Twitter feed, I need to acknowledge the founder of the Twitter feed and the work she's undertaken, a woman by the name of Karen Ingala-Smith, who's been looking at this area since 2012. And as I said, I looked at a subsample of situations relating to older women covering the same time frame. So I think it's fair to say there was broader coverage because it wasn't as restricted geographically and covered the whole of the UK. And I found 36 reports. And just very quickly, spouses or partners were involved in the murder in 13 different cases, murder by son in 10 specific cases, and the 2 with an asterisk refers to a murder which was committed jointly by a son and his father. So the mother was killed by father and son acting together. So that's not counted as an intimate partner femicide. 1 situation of murder by another relative, which was a grandson, a murder by a non-relative. There were 9 murders, and there was 1 death which had happened as a result of a burglary. So it wasn't being counted as a murder, it was being investigated as a possible murder, but the individual had died following a burglary. I'm very aware of the fact that time is whizzing on, so I'm going to skip to the fact that, limitations of the work I've been doing is that it's fairly small scale and exploratory, but certainly in relation to the media reports, although more younger women are killed overall and that's seen in both the Counting Dead Women and census reports, more older women were killed than in the youngest group of women of 14 to 25 years. And it's possible that the gap between the groups is smaller than the figures suggest because of the fact that elder abuse is underreported and things may have been missed. But what we don't know is whether the slight increase that we've been seeing in reporting is due to more abuse or improved awareness. Lack of awareness and recognition by older people, maybe because older individuals aren't recognizing situations as constituting abuse. They don't see acts as being potential crimes or identify themselves as victims. They don't want to increase risk or worsen their situation, or they may feel guilty about a situation, or indeed they may not be able to report. But I think it's important to say, abuse can happen in multiple locations. There may be polyvictimization in the same setting, but with different perpetrators. A change of setting, for example, from the domestic setting to an institutional setting, may not mean that abuse ceases, but the type may change, although the perpetrator could remain the same. And one of the cases that I came across was of intimate partner violence, which took place in a care setting, where a husband was visiting his wife and who was in a care setting and murdered her. So the way systems are set up means that cases relating to the criminal justice system are most likely to be reported and most apparent. But of course, those tend to be the most serious cases, and they're often sensationalized. And I guess one of the situations that we have is that can distort perceptions of what abuse is, and may lead to the sort of specific context around elder abuse being ignored. And it may be that the situation of abuse may not even be recognized. I think it's important that we obtain older people's perspectives on abuse, on the impacts and responses, particularly those who find themselves in precarious or vulnerable situations. And we need to include and involve individuals more at all stages of the process. We need to develop strategies to empower and develop more of those personalized approaches, and that also includes working with perpetrators. Improving recognition, awareness, understanding of domestic abuse, elder abuse, and the human rights aspects, developing prevention and protection and education, not just of the general public, but professional training, is all important. And really bearing in mind that the older people's voices and their lived experiences are really key and central here to the development of policy and practice and within the media. Thank you.
Thank you, Bridget. That's great. Would you be able to stop sharing your slides? So
yes.
People see. That's great.
Thank you.
I mean, I have to admit that although I'm chairing today's session, this isn't an area that I work in at all. And I mean, I suppose the first thing that struck me was I was quite shocked about how little information appears to be collected or that's readily available about the sort of scale of elder abuse and sort of responses to it by people like local authorities was the one thing that I was thinking about. I suppose the other thing that I was thinking in terms of, and I know it was only in one of the areas that you touched on, was about sort of abuse within institutional settings and through sort of the social care workforce, I guess. And I wondered whether, I mean, it'd be really interesting to look at Wales now, because we've gone down the route of registration and regulation of domiciliary care workers. We're just about to do it for people working in older people's homes. So there's all the fitness, there will be all of the fitness to practice type routes, as well as the other mechanisms for sort of protecting vulnerable adults. So I suppose I just wondered whether, because I sit on fitness to practice panels, I wondered whether that was something that you thought would help, I guess.
Yes, I mean, if I deal with that point and then come back to your earlier point about data and information and those sorts of things. So in relation to institutional settings, yes, it's clear that there's a range of things that might happen, and some of that will relate to the social care workforce. So registration and regulation of that workforce is very important. And I guess, in the absence of specific legislation dealing with this topic, what we've got is, in the Care Act and the Social Services and Wellbeing Act Wales, you've got sections which deal with abuse and violence, but it's not standalone specific legislation that what one might find elsewhere. For example, Scotland has the Adult Support and Protection Scotland Act, which actually has been in existence since 2008. And that's a very specific act, and it includes powers of entry, powers of removal, etc. And I know there are provisions within the Welsh legislation and within the English legislation, although we don't even have powers of entry. But I think, in the absence of that specific legislation, then clearly having mechanisms to regulate and to look at fitness to practice are very important. So one of the things which is tricky about institutional settings is there's a lack of prevalence data. And in fact, some years ago now, there was a discussion that I was involved in, which was with the then Department of Health, which is now Department of Health and Social Care. And some money was found to have a specific program about abuse in institutions. And the intention had been to have a prevalence study, but ultimately one wasn't commissioned. And one of the reasons for that was because the policy person at DH at the time changed midway through the process, and the individual who became the policy advisor decided that we didn't need to have a prevalence study. Her view, what she said very loudly and clearly, was we know that abuse happens in institutions. We don't need to quantify it exactly. What we need to do is to develop responses, which I could understand where this person was coming from, but actually in the absence of that solid data about how much abuse there is and what types, the specific types of abuse that are occurring, then the development of responses may be limited. And we're not unique in that. There's been a prevalence study in institutions in Canada, but I think that's the only country in the world that's gone absolutely down that route of trying to establish exactly, what's happening in institutions. So yes, to answer your question, I think it will be interesting to see, where you get to in Wales, because we haven't got that approach in England, and there will be people following that. In relation to lack of data, what we were finding we looked at the case information in one large safeguarding partnership. So it was, it's just a snapshot, and this was a very rapid piece of work that we undertook. And one of the things we're wanting to do is to see if we can, replicate it elsewhere. But it's very victim focused. And I understand the reasons for that, but because it's victim focused, it means that there's not very much information which is being gathered at all about perpetrators. And therefore, if we're trying to think about work with perpetrators and how to assist perpetrators, we're not even at the starting blocks, really, because, if you don't know what the situation is, how can you deal with it effectively? I'm not sure if that sort of
that's great.
Starts to answer a question there.
Yes. But in terms of comments in the chat, one of the Elizabeth Fox has made a comment which is around some of the issues that you've raised about sort of how unseen and sort of untalked about this is as an issue. And she was saying that in the Hourglass last in line research, they'd found that elder abuse, people tweeted about elder abuse 6 times less than they did about abuse of animals.
Yeah,
and so it is that thing about it. It's not really in people's consciousness, or it's not something that's sort of routinely talked about or highlighted, I guess.
Yes, I think so. And that, there are a number of reasons for that. I think part of that is the sort of ageism angle that I've been banging away at. Older people don't matter, and what happens to older people therefore doesn't really matter. But I think we're following on in a sense. So in the UK, people started looking at situations of what was being called baby bashing, baby battering back in the 60s, and then violence against younger women was started really in the 70s. And then it wasn't till the sort of late 80s, early 90s that we even started talking about abuse of adults with learning disabilities or abuse of older people. And so there's a sort of time lag, but that's still quite a long time ago now. I mean, it doesn't seem that way to me because I was in at the beginning and I was, always thinking I'm here for the long haul. I didn't actually think that I would finish my career still looking at this sort of thing, but that's fine. But I think that, it's in terms of what you'd said about, lack of information about elder abuse, lack of data about elder abuse generally, it's not a popular topic in a way. I mean, it seems weird to talk about it in that way, but I suppose, my background is in social work, work with older people, violence related stuff. But if I sort of venture into the field of gerontology and social gerontology, which is around older people, there's an emphasis on healthy aging, successful aging. It's about positivity in relation to aging and trying to I suppose, not to focus too much on what might be seen as the sort of decremental view. And if you think about, violence and abuse and those sorts of things, that's not going to attract a lot of sort of popular votes, is it? So, there's a reason why gerontologists might not look at it. And I guess there's also a reason that violence researchers might not look at it, because actually, they've been looking at the situation in relation to children, or they've been looking at the situation in relation to younger adults, rather than looking at what's happening in later life.
Yeah. Sian put a comment which actually came out of comments that were made in earlier sessions in this series, which was around whether you were aware of research specifically around violence against older men, acknowledging that obviously when we're talking about violence, we're predominantly talking about against women, but whether there had been any research specifically looking at men. And Andrea Cooper had also raised in response to that, it was saying that the Older People's Commissioner in Wales is about to publish a report exploring domestic abuse against older men, which is due to be launched in July.
Yes, I mean, it's an interesting situation in the fact, I mean, thank you for the Older People Commissioner stuff, because I knew that report was coming out, but I didn't know when. So it's useful to have that, because I can keep an eye open for it. But I think in terms of proportions, although older women are more at risk, actually the proportions of older men who may disclose abuse can be high. It depends on the specific study, but they can be higher than you would get with younger men. Yeah. So the proportion is slightly different. And, certainly in the UK study, which was all 4 nations and was a prevalence study that was undertaken a very long time ago now, reported in 2007. Actually, the older men reported higher levels of financial abuse in very old age. So the 85 plus bracket, women were reporting, this was a community prevalence study, so women were reporting neglect. The older men of that age cohort were reporting finance and financial abuse. Now that might have been because there could have been maybe, that they were not experiencing physical abuse at all, or they didn't want to talk about it or whatever. But the fact that high levels of financial abuse appear to be affecting that age group is something that could be explored some more, I think. And woman who was a social worker, Jackie Pritchard, who works independently in this area, she undertook a very early study of qualitative study, fairly small scale, but that was abuse of older men. And there's been some work in the States. So there have been some studies, but possibly there is a need to revisit it some more. And I think it will be useful seeing what's coming out of the Welsh findings to see what needs taking forward, really.
Brilliant, thank you. Jane Rose has made a comment, which is, I manage an IDVA service. We are forever battling with social services around them understanding the domestic abuse risks, particularly where there may be dementia and or care needs. They often think a carer going in once a day or 30 minutes is the answer and can't see all of the risks. Social services training needs to be improved around domestic abuse.
Absolutely, no question about that. And that was, one of the things about this, we got funding from the Home Office under a perpetrator program. And I think possibly, we managed to get the funding because it was a bit left field in a way, looking at elder abuse and domestic abuse and that sort of thing, and I, it may well be we were the only people who were putting in to look at work in that area. But one of the things that we were wanting to look at was that specific sort of conjunction between domestic abuse and elder abuse, because there's a gap in the middle. And it comes back to what I was saying about older women, that, work, the sort of violence against women, domestic abuse world tends to, they're not necessarily looking at the needs of older women, or, they're not looking at the needs of older people, although they are looking at the relational aspects. But in terms of the social care stuff and social services, they're not necessarily looking at the relationship issues. They're not looking at the violent context as a whole, or the abusive context as a whole, and therefore they're missing things because they're looking at welfare, or they're looking at what's the minimum amount of support we can put in here to keep it ticking over, which isn't exactly going to sort of meet the needs of individuals, really.
No, not at all. It's a related point, I think, that Poppy Everton had put around the hourglass, having found that most of the calls to their helpline relate to abuse within the home, and only a minority of calls relate to abuse within care homes. Yet the media coverage seems to show the opposite. So thinking about those examples you gave of media reporting being around sort of institutional care and court cases around that. Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's interesting. I mean, one might say, well, of course, or not of course, but there are mechanisms for reporting situations of abuse in institutions, either to a local authority or to the regulator, the Care Quality Commission in England, and therefore people that aren't necessarily ringing a helpline. But I think that actually, one of the values that there is of having a helpline, such as the one that Hourglass runs, which is very specific for elder abuse, means that actually, it's a repository of advice and information. So it's not about reporting. It's actually about, I think this situation is happening, and I need to talk it through with somebody. And one might have thought that, irrespective of the setting in which the abuse is occurring, you could ring a helpline to discuss that. So it is interesting that it tends to be more on the community side. And, WHO are very clear that in terms of the different types of abuse, abuse which is happening in community settings is likely to be far greater than abuse happening in institutional settings, even though the sort of attention seems to be paid to the institutional area, which may be partly too about duty of care. Yes, exactly. We've only got sort of 3 or 4 minutes left, so if anybody does have any further questions that they want to pop them in the chat.
Can I just intervene very quickly and say, the slides will be available afterwards, and I think the very last slide or next to last slide has got my email address on, and if anybody wants to follow up specifically with me, I'm more than happy for people to send me an email to have a look at.
That's fantastic. And I'm sure Sean will circulate the slides to everybody who's signed up once we've finished. Amy's put it's a broader point, I think, because it's about the links to sort of domestic violence more broadly, but she says, I work as a parenting officer at a domestic abuse service, so I work with parents who are abused by their children, and again this work doesn't get recognised at all, and these issues link to family domestic violence and upbringing whereby they have witnessed domestic violence growing up themselves. People don't necessarily understand child and adolescents to parent violence and abuse, which is family abuse, and the impact is huge. And she said, I know it's a slightly different point to this, but should be explored further, but it doesn't seem to be.
Absolutely. No, I think we're looking at a continuum, and we need to look at situations, violence, abuse, etc., across the life cycle. And that can take, many different forms, and those sort of intergenerational aspects are very important. And of course, you can have a situation where, a child who is abused as a child may grow up to abuse a parent later in life, almost as a form of payback for something that happened when they were much younger. So it's not just about, the effect on the child and what they develop as their own parenting skills for their own children, but it's also what might happen at the other end of the life cycle.
Yes. Yeah, no, exactly. Right. I think we'll draw this to a close. There's lots of comments saying that people have found it really interesting and a really nice session. So thanks ever so much, Bridget, for giving you time and doing the presentation. But thank you all for attending today. Thanks all very much for interacting and putting in your comments and questions in the chat. And once again, thanks ever so much to Bridget for coming and presenting.
Thank you.